Thanks, Ben. Thank you, everyone, and thank you to our lovely panelists for being with us this evening. We've got Anthea Corridon, Arthur Papigiannis, and Kev Lavery. And I'll just take a moment to introduce each of you and each of them to everyone and tell you a little bit about their experiences and thank them so much for their time tonight. So Anthea Corridon is the General Manager of People Partnering at Carsales. Anthea is an experienced people and culture professional with a strong background in employee relations, organisation design and development, and employee engagement. We're really lucky to have Anthea with us tonight. She's been an integral part of imagining and establishing the Carsales hybrid working environment, and Anthea will be sharing some insights with us about how they're doing that successfully at Carsales. Hi, Anthea. Arthur Papigiannis, welcome, Arthur. Arthur, for everyone's understanding, Arthur is the founder and director of AP Psychology and Consulting Services, and Arthur has been recognised for his contribution both in government and private organisations in Australia and New Zealand for developing high-level policy, strategy and service delivery in improving organisational performance in psychological health and safety. And so we're really glad that Arthur could be with us this evening to talk specifically about creating psychological safety and that creating trust in a hybrid working environment. Hi, Arthur, thank you. And finally, Kev Lavery. We're very lucky to have Kev recently joined the Thinka team in the digital learning team at Thinka. And Kev is our learning technologist. And Kev has recently, as I said, joined the team and advises us on and innovates in the area of in the technology space. He's got a very vast knowledge of virtual collaboration tools, and Kev will also support us in understanding how we can simplify and streamline our systems for digital communication, and also offer some advice to us this evening around empowering hybrid teams to work more effectively with technology. So thank you, Kev, for being with us this evening as well. So what we'll do, everybody, is we're going to start with Anthea. So we've got a couple of questions for Anthea to kick us off. So Anthea, could you tell us a little bit about what Carsales' current position is with hybrid working and specifically how it's working for your leaders and teams?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Vanessa, and really excited to be here tonight. Yeah, so I guess if I take everyone back a little bit. So yeah, I'm from Carsales.com Limited, so you might be familiar with our website, carsales.com.au, and a number of other marketplaces that we build and operate. So if we lend our mind back to not trigger everyone, but back to the start of COVID, I think to some of the points Ben and Vanessa were making earlier, we were really fortunate being a digital and being a technology company that our pivot to remote work was incredibly easy from an infrastructure point of view. Everyone had laptops. We were already in the cloud, fully on Microsoft. Zoom existed in our business already and was being used a little bit. So we were very digitally able, and that wasn't really our challenge. The bulk of our Australian-based workforce is based in Melbourne, but we also have offices throughout the country, with the next sort of largest team in New South Wales. So as lockdowns began to lift in 2021, we kept hearing from our teams and our people that they really wanted certainty on what the return to office plans would look like. We heard this through the regular surveying. We do employee engagement surveys at a couple of different points throughout the year. And we also heard this anecdotally from our people constantly saying, what's 2022 going to look like? Are you going to ask us back? Is it going to be hybrid? Is it going to be full-time in the office, a few days, no days? And they, the feedback, and it was very fair, is they wanted to start planning their lives. We had people who had moved out of Melbourne or moved out of Sydney or all around the country, and they wanted to know what that meant for their job security, their family dynamics moving forward. So prior to the end of 2021, we advised the whole business that from 2022 onwards, we would be giving people the autonomy to choose where they worked from. And that's the program that we call our working model now, which is autonomy to choose. So we said to people they could elect to be an office-based team member, which means we would give them a permanent desk, and that would mean they were committing to coming into the office 3 or more days a week. The second option was to be a hybrid team member, and that was saying that you would come to an office 1 or 2 days a week, but for the rest of the time you'd likely work from home. those hybrid workers wouldn't have a permanent desk, but they would be able to access a flexi desk. And we had no concerns about their ability to always, when they wanted to, come in those 1 or 2 days a week, be able to sit with their team and work with the people that they wanted to physically work with. And then the third category was anywhere workers. So this was where people selected and said that rarely, if ever, would we see them in an office again. So these are your sort of full-time work from home type people. As part of autonomy to choose, we did say that the give and the take, I guess, was that we would have 4 company events a year where we would expect people, regardless of work location, to come together. We would fly them in from wherever they were in the country, provide them with accommodation for that one event, that one day, which would be focused on social connection or learning and development, and really just to get our people together in a physical space. The reason that we call the program Autonomy to Choose is that we did want people to choose and to let us know which option they would select, office, hybrid or anywhere. And we really wanted some commitment and certainty from them, not just in regards, I guess we wanted that commitment and certainty, from them in regards to how they would be working. This wasn't just to allow us to plan for changes to our physical workspaces, but also so we could start to plan and understand what this would mean for our people, our ways of working, our processes, how we engaged our teams. We knew that having 3 different modes of work, office, hybrid, anywhere, would have a different impact than when we had 100% of the business working remotely at home. We knew that it would shift the way that leaders dealt with their teams. As opposed to having everybody working remotely, they'd now have people who were doing a mix of remote and in the office, or some in the office, or some who they may never see again outside of those 4 social events a year. And that was a big change for our business. When we announced Autonomy to Choose, the feedback from our teams was overwhelmingly positive. They felt really trusted. They felt that the business had listened to them, that it really allowed them to make a decision that suited them. And we trusted them to tell us what worked best for them. Our leaders were also really excited to have that confirmation and to start planning for what would inevitably be a cultural transition as well. Most positively has probably been the response we've had from the external talent market as well. We're now attracting talent from locations that we previously couldn't tap into. It's become, I guess, seen as a real benefit for people who are looking for work and engaging with Carsales in the recruitment process. So 6 months on, we're here today, and I think things are going really well. Our people and teams have adjusted well. I think what really resonated, Ben and Vanessa, you made the point around social connection, and that's something we're still hearing from our people. So despite the fact that some people have elected to work full-time from home, they're still saying, how can we be social? How can we build that social connection? And that's something that we're really kind of investigating at the moment, looking to how we can do better, how we can do more of that. We've got our first all-company event coming up in a few weeks, so that will be really exciting. But we're really seeing people embrace the new ways and the way that we're working and ensuring that everyone's included, everybody's celebrated, and they're all developed regardless of work location.
Lovely, amazing. Yeah, and what I really love about that, Anthea, is your sort of this paradox of choice and coordination seem to have really highlighted there, but equally commitment. And I think you get that activation from the team when they're feeling like they're being listened to, but then equally what's their commitment back towards the business, and then creating these social opportunities. So that's amazing. What about in terms of, we talked a little bit before about the challenges around having more difficult conversations and providing feedback. How have Carsales created a culture of feedback and coaching and development whilst leading hybrid teams?
Yeah. I think if we think back to the early days of COVID, we knew we really needed to sort of double down on our management and leadership fundamentals with a particular focus of how to do that in a virtual world. So we launched a series at that time called Leadership in a Virtual World for all our people leaders. And this really had a focus on how to set the mindset of a team when working through uncertainty and challenging times. Obviously, those early days of 2020 and those recurring lockdowns of 2021 were incredibly challenging. So how, as a leader, can you still set the right mindset and set the right motivation for your team? And how do you do that when traditional methods that were relying on physical proximity didn't exist anymore? We also covered basics and skills and upskilling in the areas like coaching and giving feedback verbally. I think, you can take for granted that someone can coach really well in a physical environment, but how do you do that when you're transitioned to working from home and you might have quite a technical job? So we had a focus on that sort of fundamentals. We also had a huge focus on wellbeing, and we really made sure that our health and wellbeing program catered to the needs of our people at that time. So dealing with stress, dealing with changing family dynamics, how to address resilience, how to address mindfulness, and not only for our people, but also for our managers. I think what we found was that managers were taking on more than ever before in terms of the wellbeing of their people. So how do we also ensure their wellbeing? There was also smaller changes we made. We introduced a Slack channel called Virtual Coffee that would automatically pair people up fortnightly and encourage them to set up a 30-minute virtual connect. And that was trying to address that missing out on that water cooler corridor conversation type thing. What was really encouraging is our senior leadership joined that channel, and we actually encouraged people to take screenshots and share their interactions, and that was really well received. It ended up being sort of one of the busiest channels you could find in our Slack network on any given day during the sort of the heights of 2020 and 2021. We also pivoted some of our sort of regular business operating models. So we used to do a monthly executive leadership team catch up where they would give an update to the business. It was called Carsales catch up and what was going on. We pivoted that to a fortnightly virtual update, and that continues today. And feedback from our people has been that they've never felt more connected and to our leaders as a result of that small change, which has been incredibly positive. During that time, we also launched a new set of company behaviours, and part of this rollout included a program for leaders on how to embed these behaviours, and involved a monthly workshop that leaders had to run with their people. And that was really about still creating some social connection and those team development and that team networking that people maybe felt that they weren't getting outside of just regular sort of project interactions. Coming out of lockdowns and the sort of the worst of the pandemic in Australia, and the introduction of autonomy to choose, we really felt that the skills of our leaders had changed. All the skills that we needed our leaders to had changed, and the basics and hygiene of managing hybrid teams we have relatively down pat quite well, but we really need a renewed focus on how to create a culture of inclusion and belonging when you have these three modes of work and you have these disparate teams. So we started to run a program with Thinka around inclusion and belonging, and this was off the back of a really strong focus the last 2 years on unconscious bias. And these workshops were all about how to create a team environment that still celebrates successes and wins. When you previously used to have everyone in one location, what does that look like now? And how to ensure you're not applying bias in your decision making, or you're not giving preferential treatment to, say, office-based workers because you're office-based. So we're still rolling out this program with the help of Thinka, and what's really exciting is at the conclusion of those workshops, all the managers will again have to run a team session, and that will be running through some practical activities with their people to work through scenarios of what it might feel like to be excluded if a project team who all happen to be in the office on one day and you're not move forward without your involvement, and just little things like that. And we're also now in the process of helping the business sort of, I guess, sometimes things that we didn't previously have to define, some of our processes and ways of working, we've recognised that we have to, and innovation is a good example of that. It used to happen very naturally. People would all be in one physical location, and then you'd have great discussions and off you'd go with a great idea. That's really changed. So we've found we've actually had to take a step back. Let's define what innovation is for Carsales, and let's go out to our people and how they can access that. So that's just one example of something we've had to refocus in this world, and things that we're sort of constantly redeveloping.
Yeah, and what I really love about the examples that you've shared is I think in isolation, if you just do one of those things, you don't actually get the full benefit, but it's this multiple touch points, if you like, that generates the community and collectively then has that impact on the team, and then also always checking back in with them as to what they need. Where's the proximity bias that can creep in sometimes as well, given that the different models. So thanks so much, Anthea, for sharing all of that. And we'll have you stick around for the Q&A as well, because I'm sure there might be some more questions to come through. Thanks so much. We might head over to Kev now and have a chat about the digital tools and technology. Hi, Kev.
Hey, how you doing, Vanessa?
I'm well, thank you. So our first question, Kev, for you is around how do we make best use of the digital tools that we've got?
Yeah, I think a big one with this is one of the things you touched on before. It's making sure that you have time to play, that you you don't use them just for work all the time or just for the one project you're using them for. I think if you buy a new car, you don't just drive it to and from work. You take it on a road trip. You take it in different circumstances. You try them out in different places and you find out different things. You don't find out what those buttons do unless you use them in different contexts. And you might find that they're useful in other situations when you do stuff like that. And I think a big one with play is thinking about using tech like a kid does. I was a teacher for 10 years and now I'm a parent. And one of the things I've noticed about kids and tech is not that kids are good at tech naturally. There's this false idea that kids come from a generation that are just naturally good at tech. It's just that they don't care if they break it. Like they're just fine with it. Yes. And that's really, really important to finding stuff out about things, is finding how far you can push it, where it's going to bend, where it's going to break, and all those sort of things are really important for figuring out how tech can work best for you. And one of the things that we talked about in the lead up to this is that if you can actually break something that you're using, if you can break some of the systems that you've got in place, then it's not actually that you've done anything wrong, that you've discovered a vulnerability in your systems. And that's a really useful thing for you to know, because if you can break it, someone else can break it too, and will, and they might break it worse than you break it in a way that causes more problems. So other things I've done in the past, I've worked in testing, and one of the things that we used to do was try and push things as far as we could until you would break them. And that's really important to kind of find out with tech. But you also, in trying to break stuff, you find out other things it does that you didn't kind of expect that it would do, or these cool little hidden features that you only really find out when you start using things the way that they're not really supposed to be used, which could uncover different ways that you might want to use it in the future. There's all the tech we've got has its regular purpose, and then it's got other things that you can do with it if you muck around with it for long enough. One of the things me and my son have done is made a stop motion animation in PowerPoint, which you can totally do because it's really easy, and it's just something that you got to have a little bit of patience, but is totally doable.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. And I totally get what you mean, because I often feel like, if I do that, I'll break it. But that's a beautiful reframe around, well, if it can be broken, which is probably unlikely, it's giving us some information that's going to improve efficiencies down the track anyway for everybody else. So, and I think, we tend to take things so seriously, don't we, with work? It's important to bring that fun and that play element to these things as well. So that's really great. That's a really good tip. What about in terms of collaboration? Was a really big challenge for many of the leaders as they talked about how to do that more effectively. So how can we unlock more collaboration out of the tools that we've got?
Yeah, so a big one with that is embracing the cloud as much as possible. We were talking about who had the final version of the presentation in the lead up to this and where it would be. And we really should just have one saved in the cloud that everyone can access. So really doubling down on your approach to the cloud and trusting that it's going to work, and not having that backup or not saving it onto your computer as well as that one in the cloud. Like that trust in that process makes things so much, it will push you forward as an organization. So you really do have to trust that you've set the cloud up properly and it's going to work. And if you haven't, again, you'll make those mistakes and you'll learn from those, and that's going to be something that's going to make things better for you in the future. Another thing is to embrace the software as a service model, which is one that we're all using heaps of, and we kind of forget what it's doing. And basically the shift to software as a service with a lot of the tech that we use meant that these companies were going to charge us more often for the tech we were using, but they had to give us something back out of it. So as a result, they all improve often. So they have rolling updates consistently, which means that there's new features and new functions inside all the tech that we're using all the time. So the last time you looked at PowerPoint, it's got a few more features than you thought it did. It's got other things that you can do with it. Things that you don't find out until you go kind of sneaking around inside and playing with. Like if you didn't know, PowerPoint will subtitle you in a foreign language if you are speaking that foreign language.
Wow.
It's just a function that exists inside it that you can set if you like in a live presentation. closed caption with AI in a foreign language.
Amazing.
And that will be useful to a bunch of people in a bunch of situations. But if you don't know that's there, you're going to go the long way around to find ways to fill that. So embracing those and getting in and checking out what different things are going to do. And I guess the other one is looking at what the purpose of all the things you're using are for. The different apps that we have are themselves applications that help us to do things. They're not the thing that you make. So you don't make a PowerPoint. Like, you shouldn't be going, oh, we need to make a PowerPoint presentation. You should be thinking, we need to make a presentation. We could use PowerPoint. We could use a range of video tools. We could use a rolling website, you know, something like Adobe Spark, where we can scroll through it as we go. There's a whole different ways that you can make a presentation, and they're not all PowerPoint. And so I guess moving away from your defaults, and if you're a leader, modeling, moving away from those defaults is really, really important, because that's kind of how you start to push yourself forward. If the because all this software is changing so rapidly, if you keep using it the same way you always have, you're losing all the benefits that you're paying for with the,
and you almost kind of, so it sounds like you get outdated with your own tools, because you're actually not experimenting and being curious about it. And I think time came up a lot in the interviews that we had, and I think sometimes I think we've got this almost blind spot around it. We think by learning something around the tool, it's going to take us more time, but what you're actually sharing is you get to use it more effectively and probably end up saving time, because you're actually more aware of how to get the most out of it.
And they're building all these efficiencies into these things, because they've looked at how can we improve all our products, and they're all looking at ways to improve it for remote work and collaboration. So this one thing that they're pushing is the same thing that we're all trying to push with it at the same time.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's really great, because I think thinking of them as tools and how we can keep using different tools, even the office now, Adam Grant was saying in a recent podcast that we need to think of the office as a tool and not necessarily just a location, because there's different ways that we can be in the office more effectively using the technology that we've got when we're there. Thanks so much, Kev, and we'll ask you to stick around as well for the Q&A, because there might be some more specific questions for you at the end of this. Thanks so much for your insights.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, Arthur.
Hey, how you going, Vanessa? Hi, everyone.
Good. Thank you again for being with us, and we're really excited to be able to get your subject matter expertise in this area of psychological safety and trust. I'm thinking we can start with psychological safety. So how do we actually create a psychologically safe? It's a big word, and I'm sure there's a lot hanging off that in terms of the workplace in a hybrid context.
Yeah, I'm probably going to share a couple of models, one from a systemic lens, but then also at the individual, when we say how do we actually create that psychologically safe culture ultimately. And first, let's go out wide and look at it from a systemic lens. You really want to look at things like leadership capability and clearly fostering that. And we heard Anthea talk to that, and clearly Kevin, and through the presentation. And then we want to move into things like work design and targeting those work design factors coupled with culture. We typically, from a psychological perspective and workplace context, we see those as the preventative factors. And that's really where you can get your biggest impact. Then you start to move into the other spaces of how do we, and we heard you, Vanessa, talking about things like coping, resiliency, and looking after our people and getting those things right to really early intervention and contact points. So how do we upskill our leaders to have better conversations, check in with our people better? And then at the tertiary space, we've really got that support recovery when things aren't quite working well. How do we do that? So I like to use that systemic lens to really assess workplaces when they're looking at workplace psychological safety.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
Then we want to move into what most people would traditionally know today, Amy Edmondson's term of psychological safety. And that really delves into the cultural aspect of how do we create that psychologically safe culture. And by virtue of the definition around that is how to create environments where people feel safe to share thoughts, opinions, views without any kind of fear of retribution or consequence. That's pretty big. You kind of go, okay, how do we do that? What does that actually look like? And we heard a lot around inclusion, learner opportunities, how people contribute. So there's really a 4-part model to that. So I'll share the bit around, because this is really important for leaders. So when we're looking at leaders, and I know a lot of leaders are here today with us. You can look at it from an organizational perspective and how do we take that systemic approach. But now as a leader day to day, how do I foster that and create that within my teams? And the first building block to this is how do we first and fundamentally create inclusion? How do we create that environment where there's respect, trust, belonging, there's no bias, and now being in this hybrid world, how do we get rid of biases in all of this? And I know we're talking about hybrid, but there's another big word there. How do we work in an asynchronous world compared to a synchronous world and so forth? So there's all these kinds of terms, but how do we create that sense of belonging? That's fundamental to the first building block of psychological safety. Once we've established inclusion, it allows us to move to the next phase and for our people to move to that next phase, which is learner safety. So we created inclusion safety. Now we want to move to learner safety. So how do we create that space again where failure is rewarded, where we use every opportunity to learn, and every aspect of what we do is a learning process. And what sits in that learner journey is really how do we get rid of fear? So how does a leader create that environment where they're able to disconnect fear from the opportunity to learn? And we're wired biologically, typically, if we don't feel included, there's no belonging, there's a greater sense of fear connected to how I contribute and what I do and what I share. So the more leaders can create that space of learning safety, it really allows them then to move to that third layer, which is contributor safety. And now I feel included, I feel I'm learning and it's safe for me to learn. So guess what? Now I feel safe to contribute, which is that contributor safety. And this is where leaders play a really big role here. This is where leaders really need to learn to talk less. They're able to voice things and share things, the space to speak and share different learnings and things that they're doing. And again, without that fear of a consequence, because if I've created inclusion, I feel safe, giving me the opportunity to learn, and there's no fear associated with that, which then ultimately allows me to contribute. Now, the fourth building block is the toughest of all, and this is where we talk about challenge. Often when we hear psychological safety, people say the space to challenge, to come out and be able to challenge things, but you need the other three building blocks. Otherwise, it can really unravel. And we can look at it from a very simplistic lens, because if we've got inclusion, safety, learner safety, contributor safety, now we start to create the environment for challenging. And this can be tough for leaders. This will now start to distinguish the leaders from managers. Because this requires a leader to have a great level of self-control, emotional regulation, and they're often going to hear things potentially that will conflict with either what they know or how things should be. But if we get the three fundamental blocks right, you can really start to create challenger safety, and this is more for the leaders here today. And you start to get, how do we allocate roles of challenging? How do I start to rotate where we have little hacks on different things? So we create the right space for things to be pulled apart and completely challenged in every way, but we rotate those roles. And what you start to do is create a comfort of people being able to challenge in healthy ways. And ultimately, with those four building blocks, if we get those right, we really start to create this space of strong psychological safety and a culture of psychological safety.
Amazing. Thank you, Arthur. In a few minutes, you've actually been able to represent it in a really easy to understand way. And I love that sort of systemic perspective, and then the individual skills that we need. I actually didn't know that we had these almost dependent. Is that the one depends on the other, doesn't it? So yeah, I must admit I was sort of more focused on that challenger safety as an understanding. And I really like the notion of speaking less. I think sometimes we do that because we think we have to fill in the space, but sometimes letting silence do the heavy lifting can help people in that way. Thank you. What about in terms of trust? So can you tell us a little bit about how we can build a trusting working environment, especially in this notion of, if you can't see someone doing the work, which came up a lot in the research interviews. And that was just one example of why trust is so important in a hybrid context. Can you expand on that for us?
Yeah, and trust is very closely linked with psychological safety, so that there's some close overlaps with that. But as leaders, one, how do we personally become trustworthy? And then how do we become trusting? Without us personally being trustworthy and trusting ourselves, it's very hard to become trusting of others. So a lot of the work has to be done at the individual level as a leader. How do I start to trust myself? How do I start to back myself in the things that I'm doing and how I go about doing things? And then obviously extend that out to the broader teams that we lead. And again, I love models or 4 kind of concepts.
Oh yeah, me too.
Basic psychology says there should always be 3, but today I'm talking about 4. People tend to grasp 3 better. But I'll use the analogy of a tree when we think about trust. That's a really good way to think about how do we build trust. Well, at the roots level, we've got integrity. So how do we develop honesty? You know, how do we lead with honesty? How do we go about doing the right thing? And how do we become trustworthy of self and others? And fundamentally, that's what people are looking for when we're looking to establish trust, the integrity of the individual. Okay, that's the first building. They're the roots. Then we kind of move to the trunk of the tree, and that's the intent. You can have integrity, but if you don't have intent, there can be conflict there, and that really that builds character. The character of trust around that. So integrity and intent. So if we're looking at the intent being the trust, and we've heard a lot about this over the course of the last 2 years, but even leadership, you know, how do we lead with care and compassion? How do we become really caring leaders in everything that we do? And I talk a lot to this in a lot of training I deliver and workshops. And care and compassion, I can care and I can say I care, but compassion is about the behavior. You can't say I'm going to be compassionate. You have to demonstrate compassion. So I like to draw those links together. So, you know, the trunk of integrity is about really, as leaders, learning to lead with that care and compassion in everything that we do. Once we've established the roots and the trunk, that allows us to move to, I guess, competence and capability. And this is where the hybrid world really comes in, because you can have good character, you can have integrity and intent, but people are also looking for competence, capability. And this is really stretched leaders and workplaces today, because leaders have now become more relevant in everything that they do. Otherwise, we're left behind. Well, it's changed. We're operating differently. And this requires, now I'm just hearing both again, Anthea and Kev and yourself and all the strategies. This is about we need to learn new ways of doing things. We need to develop new skills. We need to embrace technology. We've got to trial different things. And that in itself builds credibility again through that competence lens. So now we've got the roots, the integrity, the trunk, the intent, we've got the capability, but of course people are also looking for performance and results. With trust and strong trust, people are also looking for, you know, the success and the results in ultimately what we're trying to achieve, because without the results, it can become a bit meaningless and purposeless. We're not really clear on where we're heading or what we're doing. So that's really vital, again, to the success of leadership through the lens of trust. So I always like to look at that analogy of the tree, because that, as a leader, helps me think about where am I operating from and where am I at? Am I at the roots, the trunk, the branches, or the fruits of the tree ultimately? And they're very closely linked to, clearly, psychological safety. You know, I shared with psychological safety, inclusion is one big component to psychological safety, but we need to develop the trust. And I've just shared the 4 kind of steps or building blocks for that, which puts everyone in a good position to think about inclusivity and how they really truly establish that.
Thank you, Arthur. I think what you've been able to, that tree analogy is really quite so useful, because it's so easy to remember it that way. But what I really like about what you've shared, and this came out as well in terms of the research, there's a lot more productivity, but it can mask quite an exhausted workforce, is what a lot of the research participants were sharing. And so I love these strategies around how do we actually do the self-reflection for ourselves and understand where are we in that process. because, like you say, the more visible outcomes of trust being results and I guess commitment by the team too, to understand that they can be safe in that environment, is a direct result of your own inner work, and not sort of being productive doing things that maybe not being useful, and finding the more effective ways to do it. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. And again, we'll ask you to stick around for the Q&A, because I'm sure there will be some questions. Thanks so much, Arthur and Anthea and Kev, for your time in our panel.